First of all, I would like to introduce Adam Rogers. Adam is the articles editor at Wired in San Francisco, where he runs the front of book sections and science coverage online and edits features, primarily about science, but also other miscellaneous geekery. Rogers was a writer and on-air correspondent for the television show Wired Science, and his feature story, The Angel's Share, won the 2011 AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award. His New York Times best-selling book, Proof, The Science of Booze, won an IACP Cookbook Award and was shortlisted for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Journalism Prize, but he says it didn't win. So what, right? In his book, Rogers quotes William Faulkner as saying, "Civilization begins with distillation." Adam goes a step further and says, "Booze is civilization in a glass." He lives with his family in Berkeley. And now I'd like to introduce Amy Stewart, who is the author of 6 books on the perils and pleasures of the natural world, including Wicked Bugs, Wicked Plants, and Flower Confidential. The Drunken Botanist has been described as a fascinating concoction of biology, chemistry, history, etymology, and mixology. It's structured around the journey from mash tub and still to bottle to glass. She lives in Eureka, California, where she and her husband own a bookstore called Eureka Books. Look out for her first novel, Girl Waits with Gun, in September. Amy.
Yes. Hi, everybody. That's the perfect segue. Before we get going, I'm going to do a bit of shameless self-promotion. I have a cocktail recipe for you if you want to come get one. When I wrote The Drunken Botanist, I went on book tour and we served drinks at all my events. And I found out very quickly that if you serve drinks at your events, people totally show up. So from now on, whatever the book is about, there's going to be a cocktail. And the next book is a novel based on a true story that happened in 1914. And it's about some totally badass women and a crime that happened. So if you're into crime fiction or badass women fiction, it's going to be for you. I'll be at Mrs. Dalloway's at some point in September. But so it had to have a cocktail. And the inciting incident in the novel is a car crash. And there was a cocktail in the 1910s called the Automobile. And it is equal parts gin, scotch, and sweet vermouth. It's horrible.
Don't drink and drive. That's the moral of that cocktail.
No. Don't ever do that. But I wanted to find a way to improve on it. So since the book takes place in New Jersey, I swapped out the scotch for Applejack, total New Jersey spirit. And I added a spoonful of jam, because this is my thing right now. Putting jam in cocktails is a wonderful and delightful thing. So there's a little jam in it, and then some sparkling wine, because sparkling wine makes everything better. So if you want a cocktail recipe, come get one. And my publisher loads me up with swag. Temporary tattoos with the book cover. And there's a hashtag contest on the back. Please come take this stuff away from me at the end. That's the end of the commercial.
Did you read, you're all warm enough? We can turn up the heat a little bit if you need a little, everybody bundle up. I know it's Northern California, so it's never, this is not, we didn't talk about talking about this, but there's a great blogger who is a scientist and a cocktail guy who, his last post was all about the title was like The Perils of Pectin. And can you think of a worse thing to say into a microphone than that phrase that I just said? The perils of pectin. You're not supposed to pop like that. Yeah. Sorry. Pectin is what I was trying to say. So pectin is the stuff that holds, jams and jellies together, right? And a lot of it in apples. Right. But he was talking about trying to flavor drinks with jams, or like making damson plum gin, for example, and using a centrifuge to try to get the pectin out, but leave the flavors in. Yeah. Making cocktails has gotten to be quite a nerdy occupation, as you can probably tell from all the things we're about to talk about. So I'll send you the link. We'll put the link on the, anyway, it was fascinating.
I hate to say this in the presence of a brilliant person associated with a brilliant magazine called Wired, but all this high-tech stuff with cocktails Give me a break. I'm so over it.
Really?
The like fancy thing with the clear ice and the centrifuges and all the give me a break. Come on. Throw 3 or 4 things in a shaker and shake it up and drink it.
It's fine. It's
Shut
just
up.
what my whole book is about. It's like 4 years of my life, but it's fine. Amy, it's cool. No, it's all right. It's
No,
fine.
it's not.
Sure.
Your book is about a lot of things. All right, let's do this.
Okay, we had this notion. There's a game that you're not supposed to play called Stump the Bartender. Have any of you ever tried to play Stump the Bartender? Stump the Bartender is when you go into a bar and you think you're a badass and you try to come up with a drink that the bartender doesn't know how to make, and it proves. What does it prove? It proves you're a jerk. Because what's the point? Especially when it's a Friday night and the bar is 4 people deep and the drink that you're trying to stump the bartender with is the mojito or something, right? Where they're going to make you just muddle stuff for the rest of the night. So don't do that. But we're going to invite you to play Stump the Bartender with us with a slightly different variation, which is to say we can't actually make you any drinks. So all you have is water. You're dehydrated in this room anyway, and so that wouldn't be good for you. But we thought we would talk about some of our favorite drinks and maybe then some of your favorite drinks or ingredients for drinks, bases and other stuff, in the way that we know how to do it, which is how they make them and what's in them and why they taste the way they do. And Amy had one that she wanted to open with that I think is probably it's a great one to open with. So
Yes. So we're going to start with the Manhattan, and y'all need to think of the next drink or ingredient. You're just going to shout them out. But why don't you begin the Manhattan?
Sure. Well, so the Manhattan is a great classic Prohibition and pre-Prohibition era cocktail that doesn't have a lot of ingredients. So one of the things that when some of you were joking about all of the nerdiness of cocktails and the clear ice and the centrifuges and too many ingredients, there's a bar in Emeryville called Prize Fighter. You guys know Prize Fighter? Yes. John Santer opened it. It's a great bar. It's one of my favorites. And one of the things that John said when he opened it was that he wanted I think it's still true, but when he opened it was true, all of the cocktails are 3-ingredient cocktails. There's not a lot of stuff in them. Yeah. And in the Manhattan, what those ingredients are rye whiskey and sweet vermouth and bitters. That's it. And the ratio is even easy. It's 2-to-1 whiskey to vermouth. So there's almost nothing complicated in it. It's let's say the darker, more mysterious, and slightly sweeter cousin of the martini in that respect. Another 3-ingredient cocktail, depending on how you're making martini. Also a cocktail that until very recently people were not really making with rye very often, because you couldn't get rye very often. There were only a couple of places still making it. That's changed. It's something I was actually going to talk about a little bit too. But I think the place that I want to start with the Manhattan is, if I can step on Amy's beat a little bit, with one of the botanical ingredients, which is that rye. Because it's fascinating when you think about the idea of making booze out of a grain.
A grass, no less.
A grass, that's right. So it's only, 150 million years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get a Manhattan, because grasses hadn't evolved yet. Imagine how depressing that would have been to go to a bar 150 million years ago and be like, can I get a whiskey? And the guy's like, no.
No. We have a nice conifer.
That's right. You can get like a fir.
Beer.
You can get like that fir flavor, the Douglas fir schnapps or something.
Yeah.
That you can have that.
That's it.
But that's it. Plus, your forehead would be really bony and terrible time for drinking. Worse than Prohibition. When yeast ferment, they're eating simple sugars and excreting and pooping out carbon dioxide and ethanol. It's one of the most miraculous pieces of nanotechnology evolution ever came up with, like a Babelfish scale kind of miracle in nature. But they can only eat certain sugars. Everybody in here, I'm assuming that all of us are humans and none of us are mutants. Not that I have anything against mutants, it's totally fine, big X-Men reader, but the point is if all of us are sort of mainline Homo sapiens, our saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, helps us break down starches, which are really just complicated sugars. But yeast don't have that advantage. So if we want yeast to make booze out of something that's mostly starch, like a grain, a grass, we have to do some work on that stuff for them first. It's called malting, where you take, let's say, barley, and you begin the process of germination. You tell those barley seeds that they're starting to grow, and they start to make an enzyme themselves that breaks down the starch, which is really the analog to an egg yolk in a seed. They start turning that starch into sugar so the embryo has something to eat while it's growing. And almost all of the brown liquors, the distilled stuff that we think of as whiskeys, relies on that enzyme, that process. Rye is harder to malt than barley. So when a lot of the rye, even the really good ones that you can get now, 95% rye, that last 5%, the last mile there, is usually barley, because they need that enzyme to make that conversion, that saccharification process. Without that extra step that human beings bring to it, you could have spontaneously fermented wine in the world, or mead, let's say, because of the simple sugars in those ingredients. But if you want something made from a grass, if you want a brown liquor, a whiskey, something based in barley or corn or rye, then human beings have to come to the table. It's a technological, chemical advance that we figured out how to do, which I always think is exciting, and more proof that our relationship, as Amy's book suggests, our relationship with these ingredients and our relationship with nature are all intimately tied up.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I will add to the whiskey part of the Manhattan, it's easy to sort of count the plants here. I mean, we have barley, we have rye. If one were to make it with bourbon, you'd have some corn, maybe a little wheat in there. But there's this other plant in the whiskey. Does anybody know what it is? Anyone? The oak tree. The mighty oak plays such an important role. If you're going to call it, I think this is true with, is this true with rye as well? Do they have to age it in a new American oak barrel, or is it only bourbon? There has to be a brand new barrel.
I think the rules for rye are sketchier, but anytime it's brown, they're coming off of new oak.
Well, anyway, our wonderful American oak trees are very high in a molecule called vanillin, which is really the exact same flavor that the vanilla bean orchid produces. It's one of the reasons why you can make artificial vanilla flavoring from sawdust, because there's enough vanillin in it. So you take this alcohol out of the still, and alcohol is a solvent. You put it up against wood, and it's just going to pull whatever it can out of the wood. So it's pulling out these delightful vanilla flavors, and because the wood has been toasted a little, it's getting these caramel, toasty flavors, and that's where it's getting its color and its wonderful flavor. And there's a little bit of oak tree DNA in every sip. Like, you're drinking a little oak tree in every sip, which I think is kind of cool.
Have you all had White Dog or unaged whiskeys, the clear stuff? Sort of sometimes I'll market as moonshine. Have any of you ever tasted it? It's worth tasting, not necessarily because it always tastes that good, because sometimes it doesn't. Although I've gotten to taste some bourbons fresh off the still, like off the still head when it comes right out, and universally I find them fantastic. They're really delicious. You taste a lot of the corn. There's almost a popcorn flavor. They tend to be very strong, because one of the things that happens with aging is that they'll lose some of the alcohol content, and then often those things are proofed down. They'll add some water to get to that 80 proof that a lot of whiskeys are sold at. But one of the reasons I like to do that is that you can taste what the oak and the age add when you taste that. It's worth, if you get to a bar where they have that stuff, ask for half a glass, or if you go on a tour of a distillery to taste it, just so that you can really tell that, because it's so striking. It's not just the extra 10%. It's the other half of what you taste in these brown liquors. It's really amazing, and the chemistry is not well understood. The basics of it are, as Amy just laid out, and more large distilleries are trying to do some of their own experimentation with different kinds of aging, different conditions, different humidity, different temperature, mostly because it takes a long time and that costs them money. Right, you make something and then you have to wait for 10 years before you can sell it. It'd be nice to do it in 5 years. And as whiskey and single malt, especially bourbon too, have gotten more and more popular, they're running out of old stuff to sell. They would like to make something younger that tastes about the same, so that they can charge you just as much or maybe more for it. And it's frustrating because that science is proprietary. A lot of these distilleries aren't publishing it. So I found it, for example, very hard to do a lot of the reporting in the aging chapter of my book, because they just won't tell you.
They won't talk.
Yeah, they're jerks, is my point. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm coming around to.
Well, let's get to my favorite ingredient in a Manhattan, which is the vermouth. I think the most botanically interesting. So how many of you like to go home at the end of a long day and relax with a nice glass of vermouth? Can I get an amen? I knew, because I'm in Berkeley. I do this in Memphis, nobody raises their hand. But here, so vermouth is a wonderful thing to drink all by itself, if it's good quality and it's been handled properly. Vermouth is nothing but wine with some herbs and spices and fruits added to change the flavor. and maybe some caramelized sugar in the case of sweet vermouth, and then a little bit of alcohol to proof it up to maybe 17%. But it's basically wine, which means that you have to treat it like wine. Once it's open, it needs to be in the fridge, tightly sealed, and you've got a month, maybe 6 weeks. So you have to apply yourself to that situation. You need to make some progress on that. Any of you who have a bottle of vermouth at home that's been open and sitting on a shelf for 6 months or 6 years, you need to go home right now and pour that out.
You should just go.
Yeah, no.
You're not acceptable.
Good vermouth is very drinkable on its own. Equal parts sweet and dry vermouth over ice is about the most delightful thing in the world. And they're very good mixed with club soda and sparkling wine and all kinds of things. So get into crazy vermouths and all these aperitif wines. It's a wonderful category of stuff. But this is the Greeks and Romans were adding plants to wine as preservatives, maybe to mask the flavor of horrible wine. Never delude yourself that they were drinking great wines in Roman times. They totally weren't. We are living in the golden age of alcohol right now. It was never better than it is today. But these plants include Artemisia absinthium, wormwood, which is you get the common name with vermouth, and usually there could be some citrus in there. There could be some spices like cardamom, mace. There could be something like rosemary. It's really up to the maker of the vermouth what all they put in there, but something to give it that bitter wonderfulness that vermouth has. So easily another, 12 or 15 plants just in your vermouth, and often with many vermouth makers, 20 or 30. Good stuff.
What I think is cool about that too is that what goes wrong with that vermouth that you had sitting in your refrigerator for a year and a half or 2 years is primarily a process called oxidation. Right? That's what goes wrong with the wine that you're keeping on that shelf for forever too. And what that is it really is what it sounds like. Oxygen atoms are getting added to the various molecules that are in there that are giving some of the aromas and the flavors in that vermouth. But oxidation's not always a bad thing. We were talking about aging, and when you're aging a distilled spirit, one of the things that you're hoping will happen is a certain amount of oxidation and also esterification, the formation of molecules called esters, which are alcohols and oils attached to each other, because those are things that are contributing those flavors that when you know that joke where they drink a really rough, horrible spirit and somebody coughs and says that it's smooth, like the old westerns or whatever, but that smoothness is a result of that process of oxidation and esterification. One of the molecules that you were looking for specifically, this is especially true in whiskey again, is something called either an oak lactone or a whiskey lactone, sometimes a coconut lactone. They really are a sort of coconutty, oily flavor and feel in the mouth that makes something feel smooth. And in fact, in those spirits that I was talking about where they were trying to age them for a shorter period of time, or sometimes in a smaller barrel because they get more surface contact with what's distilling, you'll get some of the same extractive flavors from the wood. You'll get some of that vanillin. You'll get some of the molecules that we associate with the flavor of wood, but because you don't have the time, which is how you get oxidation esterification, those flavors don't have kind of that rounded edge. They have sort of a sharper edge. To me, they always taste a little bit green or resiny. And in fact, again, just trying to bring that full circle, those resins, those flavors are sometimes what you actually wanted as preservatives. Those ancient wines, the ancient Roman and Greek wines that wouldn't last long at all, the people who made them would add as plant ingredients resins to try to make sure that they would be medicinal and also last longer. And if you do want to taste what those might have tasted like, you can get Retsina. Have you ever tried that, the Greek Retsina? It's delicious, right?
Yeah, it's worth seeking out.
But it's worth trying because it tastes like, it probably tastes very much like what 5,000 years ago when somebody was having a glass of wine after a hard day as a galley slave. I don't know what you came home with from 5,000 years ago. That's what they were drinking. That stuff.
A little bit of tree resin.
That's right. Tree resin. Delicious tree resin.
Delicious tree resin. Now the bitters, the Angostura bitters, or in your Manhattan, we could talk about that for the entire hour. I devoted way too long a chapter to the Angostura tree in Drunken Botanist because it's got such a fascinating story.
Not long enough. Was it too short a chapter?
Oh,
maybe?
Thank you. Yeah, I could have gone on for weeks and weeks with that. Suffice it to say, for those of you who don't know, bitters in the 1900s and before, in the 1800s and before, were medicine. So if you got sick, there was no Walgreens, right? There were no pills. There were plants. And soaking plants in alcohol is a way to extract some active ingredients, keep it kind of stable on the shelf until people got sick. And so bitters were something that you'd order up in a pharmacy and that they would make. And there are lots of recipes for Angostura bitters in these old pharmaceutical books, which are delightful to read. I'm very fortunate to be married to a rare book dealer, and so many of these wonderful old books were just placed in front of me at the dinner table for me to page through. I know.
Cheater.
Yeah. Good. It's a good life. Usually it's some kind of tree bark, very often believed to have medicinal qualities, like the bark of the Angostura tree or the cinchona tree, quinine. So something that did give it an actual bitter quality, and a whole bunch of other plants that pharmacists thought maybe would make you better, probably wouldn't. But that's what you had. And so bottles of bitters were labeled as medicine until well into the early part of the 20th century, when doctors started to professionalize a little bit and say, you know what, we have to stop putting medical claims on these bottles. It's making us look bad. And everybody kind of retooled and became cocktail ingredients. They had a delightful note of complexity because of the huge range of plants in them. And even in a Manhattan, which is already a botanically complex drink, you get quite a bit more out of that 1 or 2 drops of bitters. I recently had a pina colada with a little Angostura bitters in it. Boy, does that turn that into a grown-up drink. It no longer tastes like a beverage for a 5th grader. It tastes like something that we should actually be drinking.
Your 5th graders are mature. What do you? That's a hell of a 5th grader. Pina colada here with the free lunch in Berkeley. That's what Alice Waters has been working on secretly. Is the pina coladas with the lunches. That was Philip Marlowe's drink too, right? In the mystery novels, a gimlet with a gin gimlet with a half dash of bitters, which is also a delicious drink. As long as they have fresh lime at the bar, don't let them pour the roses into it.
Never permit anything but fresh squeezed citrus.
Do you know Darcy O'Neill's work on pharmaceuticals? So Darcy O'Neill writes a lot about booze. And came at it from basically access not just to rare books, but to a school with a really good pharmacy program and their library. And his kind of excavation of the history of what pharmacies were for cocktails is really fascinating. One of the things that he talks about is that well into the 40s, in the 1940s in this country, bars were places where women weren't allowed to go. But pharmacies, which were also soda fountains, were. So a pharmacy was a place where you could actually go on a date acceptably, And what they did was, in addition to making medicinal bitters, they were also making ice creams, and they were also making Coca-Cola, right? The syrups that we think of as soda pop now grew out of pharmacists making their own mixes. So for him, I think a lot of the untold history of the cocktail, of people taking like ingredients off a shelf and saying, well, I've got access to some soda water, I've got access to a bitters, I have access to some booze because we're allowed to sell it, I have access to laudanum because we're allowed to sell that.
Sweet. Opium poppy.
Right?
Yep.
Another botanical ingredient. Like, to be able to mix all those things together came out not out of what we would think of as a bar in the teens in this country, but out of a pharmacy, out of a soda fountain.
Well, should we get some ideas from the audience here?
Yeah, what do you guys like?
What do you want to hear about?
Oh. I love a good Mai Tai, which you can almost never find. So the Mai Tai, do you know which island the Mai Tai originated on? Which beautiful, wonderful island it originated on? Alameda is the island the Mai Tai originated on. Mai Tai grew out of the great tiki movement of the 1940s and 50s, which originated here in the Bay Area. You can still have a couple of great tiki bars in San Francisco and in Alameda. I once tried to make, for an event, the California Historical Society, an all California ingredient Mai Tai.
So what was?
Well, you can get rums now
Sure.
that are California rums. St. George Spirits makes a rum
Yes.
that's delicious. And at the time, he didn't have any aged yet, so you need a clear one and a brown one.
Yep.
So I got his clear one at the time, and there was a California aged rum as well. And you need orgeat, which is a syrup made from, tastes like almonds, actually usually made from apricot pits. So it also will not cure cancer, just like a medicine that they used to make from apricot pit. But tastes very almondy, and it's a thick syrup. And a woman named Jen Colio, who's now the bartender at a place called The Interval, the Long Now, in Fort Mason, and came up through bartending at the Slanted Door in San Francisco. Really wonderful person, and also has a company called Small Hand Foods and makes a lot of these pre-prohibition, prohibition era syrups.
Small Hand Foods is the greatest, and I just want to give a shout out to their tonic syrup, which we consume by the case at the Stewart Brown household. Yeah, really good stuff. It's
terrific, and so she's Californian, so I had her orgeat, and there is actually one place that will make an equivalent to a curacao, an orange-flavored liqueur. So triple sec, curacao. What's the one that goes in the Cadillac margarita? The name just jumped out of my head.
Well, like
Cointreau, thank you.
Yeah.
And Cointreau's cognac-based versus triple sec being sort of vodka-based.
Grand Marnier,
is another one. And what you really want for those are these little tiny bitter oranges that grow on the island of Curacao. They aren't blue. It will surprise you to hear. That was one of those 1950s replacements for something you couldn't get anymore, because what the people on Curacao who made Curacao forgot to do was trademark the name Curacao. So you want to make Curacao, you can go home and do it. And they do make one in California, and all of it is very small batch, and all of it goes to bars. They don't sell it in else. And I tried to get a couple of bartender friends to be like, can you have nothing? So I did have to cheat on that one. But it's a terrific drink when you taste it. And when I finally made it for a friend, and I said, I'm going to make you a Mai Tai, and he scoffed because he expected the sort of cherry-colored kind of Coca-Cola tasting horrible rum stuff that you get at most bars. And I made it for him, and he tasted it, and I got the reaction which you always want from someone, which is, that's a Mai Tai? Yeah. It's like, yes, nailed it.
Well, I will say about rum, rum's really fascinating to me because sugarcane, of course, is another one of these giant grasses. It's interesting how much we want to make booze out of grass. Only in this case, the sugar's in the stalk. And you think, well, what good does it really do the plant to store that much sugar in the stalk? You understand why they'd store it in the fruit or the seeds or the tubers underground, but why the stalk? And it turns out that sugarcane, you know how it's got those kind of segments, those joints and the little nodes in between? Well, there's a little bit of root tissue and leaf tissue in every one of those segments. So if it falls over, they each start putting down roots and sending up leaves. So they need that sugar to eat while they're growing and into mature plants. So that's why it's all there, which is very handy for us in the case of rum. And I think the great thing about rum is that you, again, can taste the effects of wood maturation between a white rum and a dark rum. In the Caribbean, where they're aging it, it's like 1 year of wood maturation in the Caribbean is equivalent to, 7 years in Scotland. I mean, the humidity, it's moving in and out of the wood a lot more. And what this means is that there are some incredible values to be had in aged rum. I mean, you can get, if you spend $30-40 on a bottle of aged rum, you'll get something that will just knock your socks off compared to sort of the equivalent quality in Scotch, in my opinion. So I think there's some wonderful stuff to try there. And of course, you do get in the white rum, you get kind of a little bit of the grassiness of the plant itself, which is a delightful thing.
Actually, you guys probably wouldn't like those rums. Don't go buy them. It's fine. You don't want them. It's all right. I'll get it. It's cool. The thing about rum too that I love is that we talk. I did it already here today. Is kind of privileged the yeast as the microorganism most responsible for booze.
Oh,
this fungus, that does that conversion I was talking about. But rum is one of the great examples of underappreciated other microbes that make rum taste the way it does. In some rums, especially the ones. Well, actually, let me back up. You can imagine that. Just like I said, that yeast want a simple sugar to eat, and so do other microorganisms as well. That's their favorite food. So when you're making rum in a humid petri dish environment like the Caribbean, let's say, you really have to put your distillery right next to your sugar processing plant, because any amount of time that sugar water that you get out of the cane spends sitting out, it's going to get colonized by the local flora and fauna, the local microflora and microfauna. So you need to rush it into the distillery. And in fact, if you are processing it and just take that sugar juice and make it right into a rum, it's called a rum agricole, and it does taste very different. That's what they're doing at St. George. You really taste those grassy notes. If it's made out of molasses, that's the other rum that most of us think. When you think of Bacardi, let's say, and I'm going to suggest maybe don't think of Bacardi, but when you think of Bacardi, that's made out of molasses primarily. But those other colonizers, in some places that are making rum, especially agricoles, especially in former French colonies, will take advantage of those other microbes. So they'll actually take some of the stuff that's left in the still after a distillation. They'll scoop it out, and they'll bury it in a pit in the ground for a few months. It's called a dunder pit. It looks really gross.
How many bars around the world are named Dunder Pit?
It's a good name for a bar.
It's an awesome name for a bar.
Great, actually. And in fact, there were, except for the work of a guy named Rafael Arroyo in the 1950s, who the Puerto Ricans set up with a lab to study rum when they realized there was going to be a market for the gringos up north. Nobody really studied what microbes were going into a dunder pit because they're just the locals. They're just the ubiquitous stuff that's in the air. Now there are a few folks who are starting to study what really went in, what microbes show up there, and start to make these really weird esters, really weird aldehydes, and very strange organic molecules that they then scoop back out. They scrape off the scum off the top, scoop out this stuff, and then put it into the next round of distillation. In that sense, it's a lot like sour mash, if you know what that term is. You take something from the previous distillation, put it in the next one. But for here, they're trying to get those molecules, and those molecules do make it over the top of the still. They'll get into the next batch, and they contribute some very, very weird flavors that I think kind of go unloved.
Yeah, I've done blind tastings of rums alongside other spirits and not been able to figure out that I was drinking a rum.
Wow, that's
which I love.
Yeah.
Let's hear another drink. Oh, 2 votes for Negroni.
That's right.
Yes.
That's because it's National Donut Week, right?
Right.
What an interesting marketing thing that is, if you think about what that has meant. I love Negronis as a separate issue, but what an interesting thing to think that there is a cocktail that is now that you can market and people understand it and make different bars. And there's a company that can sell enough of one of the key ingredients that's really changed. That never used to be. You can't imagine in the 1980s National Martini Week or something, right? They didn't do that. But things have really changed. The way people drink in this country has really changed. It's interesting, but.
Well, Campari is the piece of this that I want to talk about. Lots of Campari fans, am I right? Yeah. And Campari and soda in the summer, I think, is just a delightful. That's what I order if I'm at a bar, but I don't want to drink, like I got to stay kind of sober. A club soda with just a tiny bit of Campari in it is so wonderful, and it looks like you've got a grown-up drink in your hand, and yet you're well-behaved all evening. But so the interesting thing to me about Campari and some of these other Amaros, these other sort of bitter, it gets into digestives, is the gentian. So gentian is an herb that grows in the Swiss Alps. Now there's different species of gentian all over the world. There's thousands of them, but the one they use grows in the Swiss Alps, big yellow flowers, gigantic roots. You got to pull the whole plant out of the ground to harvest it. And these bitter roots have been used to treat stomach disorders forever. Going back, and this is my crazy research story that I like to tell. If I read in someone else's book that the ancient Egyptians used this as medicine or whatever, that's not good enough for me. So if it's, according to the Ebers Papyrus, the Egyptians used blah, blah, blah. The Ebers Papyrus has been digitized, and you can look at it. And you can find a hieroglyphic person to point you to where it says gentian in the Ebers Papyrus. And I fact-checked the Ebers Papyrus, damn it, and it's in there.
That's some good reporting, Amy. That's nice.
I'm a freak for primary sources. There's also a Latin American codex that has, pre-European medical text, and in China as well. So it's been used as a medicine for a very long time, and it is the only, it's the only one you're going to get out of me. It's the only example of a medicinal plant whose effects you can experience in a cocktail. People always want me to say that their cocktail is a health drink, and I'm like, who are we kidding? I'm not gonna, you're on your own. Good luck with that. But in this case, there's very good research about this. There's a woman at Rutgers who's sort of the top person in the world who I interviewed. She does work on this, Dr. Lena Strew. If you swish around something that's got gentian in it, like Campari or Suze, which is a wonderful aperitif wine with gentian, The bitter compounds that end up in the drink from the gentian talk to the nerve endings in your mouth before you've ever swallowed it, which talk to your brain, which talks to the rest of your body, and tells your body to produce more saliva and gastric fluids. Basically get your whole digestive system working all at once. It's under investigation right now as a good treatment for people who are going through maybe cancer treatments and they can't swallow or can't get their appetite back, because you don't even have to swallow it. You can just swish it around and all of a sudden all this stuff is happening. So next time you have a Negroni or a Camparian soda or something like that, take a sip and I want you to notice that you're drooling a little more than usual. And you can think about me and our day we had together, but that's, you're actually experiencing the medicinal effect that people have been after all this time. And it's interesting to me when it turns out that 100,000 years of human experimentation isn't wrong, and that these plants that have been believed to be medicinal for something, now we have the science to show that they actually are. And you can get that out of your Negroni. Does Chinar do that too? Yeah. Gentian, you'll find it in Chinar. You'll find it in Aperol. There's a little bit in Angostura Bitters. And once you learn to recognize that flavor, you'll pick it up, especially in a lot of these wonderful aperitif wines that we can get now in the U.S. Suze, by the way, any Suze fans here? S-U-Z-E. It's a French white aperitif wine with gentian. You can do a lovely white Negroni with Suze. It's delicious.
Okay, so you know the Black Death, right?
Oh, sure.
So the Black Death, if you were a doctor trying to treat the Black Death, you didn't have a lot of options because nobody knew what caused the Black Death and because doctors didn't know anything. But what you had was a fairly recent discovery of this chemical that was an excellent solvent for other compounds, molecules, flavors, alcohol, because people had figured out how to distill something fermented and make something distilled that you could drink. And unlike almost every other chemical that doctors or healers tried to give people who were sick, alcohol actually did something, right? You could feel it. You'd give it to somebody and somebody would feel different. And it would numb pain, and it would keep food from spoiling when ordinarily it would. And it would, it would do all the stuff that we sort of take for granted now. But imagine, like, if you never had access to
Kill
that.
bacteria.
Kill bacteria. So having finally had access to something that actually seemed to do something, doctors during the time of the Black Death started giving it to everyone, which by the 1700s resulted in, at least in England, in something called the gin crisis. Basically, everyone was really addicted to gin. And it had all the same hallmarks of every other kind of chemical scare that we still experience today, of like, oh, we should make it illegal, and oh, people are killing their babies, and oh, it's making it so that the poor are preferentially. Anyway, all the same stuff that people will say about marijuana now, they said about gin in the 1600s and 1700s in England. But gin is really fascinating stuff, and probably what they were drinking then didn't taste like what we think of as London dry gin now. If you get Beefeater now, and it's that sort of dry, citrusy sort of flavor, mostly what they were drinking then was probably what we would now call Dutch style, which is a much more malty flavor. If you think of like Ball's Jenever, or Anchor makes a gin called Genevieve. If you ever tried that, it's delicious. Really a malty, kind of more viscous taste. It's also a cheaper thing that a lot of craft distilleries can make. Unlike something like a whiskey, you don't have to spend 10 years aging a gin. You can age it if you want, but you can also just make the stuff and run it. Most distilled spirits are, you'll take something fermented, a fruit juice that you ferment, or a beer, essentially, and run that through the still. And the still, which is basically a separation technology, right? You're separating molecules out based on the temperature at which they evaporate using energy. We'll take some of those flavors and the alcohol and send that over the top and then recondense into a liquid, and everything else stays behind. But gin is a little bit weird, because when you're making gin, you are going to take something that's fermented, but it doesn't really matter what, because you're going to distill it a bunch of times to take most of those flavors out. Dutch style gin, you're going to leave the malt in. London style, maybe you'll let it turn into vodka. basically something that's almost flavorless, and then distill that so that those vapors go through a bunch of sets of botanicals, a bunch of different flavors that they'll actually put into the still, into the column that comes up from the still, in little baskets. Depending on what flavor you want to choose, you can put anything in there. Caraway, often it'll be you'll think of
Coriander's
juniper.
in there a lot?
Juniper is the classic one. Juniper in Dutch is jenever is where the name comes from, right? But coriander, sometimes rose petals, any of those flavors that you can think of from all the different gins that you might have tried, and they let the vapor from the still go up through those and pick up the alcohol, sort of dissolves those flavors out and carries them up over the top of the still. So there's a distillery in Washington, D.C. It's the first distillery in D.C. since colonial times, basically. And he makes 4 gins seasonally. So every time the seasons turn, he'll change what the botanical mix is so that they're more in keeping with the season. So the winter one tastes more like a Christmas tree, and the spring one tastes more like spring, I don't know.
Flower garden.
That's right. And they're very good. But it also makes gin essentially the first flavored vodka.
Yes.
Right? It's basically just vodka with flavors. It's just juniper and botanical flavors instead of, I don't know, marshmallows or whatever.
This comes as a real shock to people who say that they are gin drinkers and they never touch vodka. I have very bad news for you. But one thing, I know we need to wrap up. I just want to say quickly, if you're going to put the word gin on the label, it has to contain juniper. There are so many American distilleries making wonderful gin-like things that they don't want to put juniper in, but they also don't want to call it flavored vodka. And you kind of have to read between the lines. It'll sort of be American botanical spirit or something. But go forth and explore some of that. They're doing interesting things, and the law just hadn't quite caught up. Are we at our limit?
We are just about at our limit. We're supposed to end at 50 minutes. So if there's one more quick thing.
Oh, good.
And otherwise, we're going to hustle across the street for book signing.
We'll do a speed round. Somebody have
Speed
one more
round.
they want to do super fast?
Okay, thanks.
Is there any truth to the assertion that there's cyanide in fruit pits, and therefore it's illegal in California to distill a whole cherry or a whole apricot?
Yes to the first half and no to the second? There's
Right.
very, very tiny amounts of
Yes.
poisonous stuff, right?
And
It's whether there's cyanide in fruit pits and whether there's enough to make it so that you shouldn't be able to make, let's say, maraschino out of cherry pits or orgeat out of apricot pits.
right, and it's stone fruits, and there's such a thing as bitter pit and sweet pit. So with apricots, for instance, there's very few varieties of sweet pit apricots out there, but that's what in Europe they would use to make amaretto and other things that are flavored with apricots. The bitter pit ones do have higher levels of cyanide, so it is helpful to know what you're doing, but yes, there's definitely a little bit of cyanide in there. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.